Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Matt Levitt, Director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our counterterrorism lecture series, today featuring a good friend, Daniel Kimmage, who is the Principal Deputy Coordinator of the State Department's Global Engagement Center. The Islamic State's been a strategic pioneer in the use of online propaganda and social media to recruit and inspire, even mobilize individuals to carry out acts of violence. Countering such activity is now a cornerstone of the international counterterrorism agenda. Taking the lead on this, coordinating the U.S. interagency effort, is the State Department's Global Engagement Center, which is a data-driven group that proactively addresses foreign adversaries' attempts to undermine U.S. interests via disinformation and propaganda. This includes not only state actors, such as Russia and China, Iran, but also terrorist organizations and other sub-state actors. So to discuss these efforts, I'm really pleased to have Daniel with us today. Prior to serving as the Principal Deputy Coordinator for the Global Engagement Center, Daniel served as the Acting Special Envoy and Coordinator from January 2017 to January 2019. He is not new to this realm at all. Previously, he covered counterterrorism issues for the Office of Policy Planning and as Principal Deputy Coordinator for the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to all of the viewers and listeners out there in the virtual world. So the Global Engagement Center in its current form was created by the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, and it was created to coordinate the efforts of the U.S. government to counter foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation that aims to undermine the interests of the United States, our allies, and partners. This builds on two earlier efforts, both of which focused on counterterrorism and both of which were created by executive orders. Matt mentioned one when he went through my bio, was the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, and the second was an earlier version of the Global Engagement Center created by a 2016 executive order and focused on countering ISIS. But in 2017, Congress recognized an urgent national security imperative and expanded the Global Engagement Center's mission. Today, the GEC at the State Department not only focuses on terrorist propaganda, but also on disinformation and propaganda spread by adversarial state actors to undermine U.S. security, policy, and those of our partners and allies. So let me talk broadly at the outset about four major GEC milestones in the recent past. And the first is our analytic work. As we've built up the GEC, one of our key goals has been to make sure that it is driven by data and analysis. And to do that, we've created a team of more than 30 data scientists who analyze open source developments in the information space. That team is producing analysis that informs actions by our State Department colleagues and our interagency partners, and also they lead collaboration with a range of other U.S. government and international partners. Secondly, we know that we can't do this alone. However much the Global Engagement Center expands, it needs to be at the hub of a much larger effort. And so as we've built up our own capabilities, we've also established and strengthened government-to-government partnerships that enable us to coordinate our analysis and, more importantly, our actions over the long term. Third, we are taking proactive action globally. We're executing campaigns, programs, and initiatives to reduce the space available to bad actors for nefarious influence activities. And finally, because we understand that technology is woven into virtually every aspect of this problem, we are trying to stay ahead of that curve as well. So we've launched a comprehensive framework to drive U.S. and international coordination on technology and specifically on counter-disinformation technologies and their implementation. This framework was recently highlighted favorably by the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and I'll talk about its components a little bit later. So bottom line is we have established a level of coordination that didn't previously exist in the U.S. government. Let me talk now about some of our organizational components. So first among those are our threat teams. We have teams focused on Russia, China, Iran, and counterterrorism. They conduct specific operations, and they also carry out interagency coordination to counter propaganda and disinformation from those threat actors. Second are our functional teams. These include our analytics and research team, which I spoke about above in the context of its analysis, and our technology engagement team, which I'll go into a bit more detail later on. Third, we have an interagency and international coordination cell, which, because government loves acronyms, we call the I2C2, and it is comprised of liaison officers from departments and agencies, and in the case of the Department of Defense, from combatant commands, so that we're connected as we need to be with those partners to coordinate. Now, let me talk a bit more about our analytics support. To counter adversarial propaganda and disinformation, we really need the best possible understanding of the information environment, and we need to share that understanding with our partners, both within the US government and internationally. Over the past year, we've conducted analysis touching on at least 77 countries. We tailor our analytic products to the needs of our consumers, who are typically an embassy, a State Department bureau, or one of our international partners. These reports are designed to be actionable and unclassified. There's a growing demand for open source data and research. And we do this so that when we put this in the hands of, for example, an embassy on a Tuesday morning, they can go and do something with it almost as quickly as possible, whether that's writing talking points or reallocating resources to a program that they're supporting. What we want to do is tell the embassy what is happening in a quantifiable and data-driven manner, whether or not some propaganda or disinformation event is prevalent in the information space, whether or not it's coordinated by a threat actor, whether it dovetails with prevailing sentiment among a target audience, and what can be done. We also benefit, of course, from feedback from our colleagues in the field who have a fantastic grasp of local dynamics, politics, culture, and history, and that is an iterative cycle. Let me talk about our work in the context of the COVID crisis. In January 2020, we already began to look at propaganda and disinformation in this context. It rapidly became clear that this would be an issue of global consequence, not simply in the scope of the crisis, but also in our area of propaganda and disinformation. We saw Russia pushing conspiracy theories. We saw the People's Republic of China suggesting various false and nefarious narratives about the origin of the virus. And we began to see a certain narrative convergence between the Chinese and Russian efforts. These were not the only countries to push these false narratives, but they have very well-developed mechanisms and ecosystems to spread their messages to audiences around the world on a variety of platforms. We took a multifaceted approach in our efforts to counter this wave of COVID-related disinformation and propaganda. First, we tracked all of it beginning in January 2020. We released reports. One of our first reports looked at Russia's disinformation campaign on the virus and how it spread through their ecosystem. Secondly, building on this analysis, we worked to expose these disinformation efforts. Here I would flag for everyone, while most of our reports are for internal use, we do public products as well. And last year we released a major report on the pillars of the Russian disinformation ecosystem, which highlights the proxy news outlets and websites that they use, but also focuses on the role of that ecosystem in spreading COVID-related propaganda and disinformation. Third, we worked with the media to inform the public, for example, about Beijing's propaganda and disinformation campaigns on the polemic. And finally, we provided rapid response grants to local organizations on the front lines fighting the adversarial narratives of the COVID infodemic, as some have called it. Now let me talk a little bit more about our threat teams. Our Russia team, it leads and coordinates US interagency and global partner efforts to understand, expose, counter, and to build resiliency to Russian malign influence that aims to undermine democratic systems. Our China team focuses on three priority lines of effort. The first is to puncture PRC propaganda narratives through high-quality open source research. The second is to build resilience among civil society and media. And third is to carry out strategic communications campaigns aimed at reducing the space where Beijing's whole of government influence campaigns, propaganda, and disinformation can thrive. Our Iran team works to deny Iran use of disinformation that undermines US policy. To this end, the GEC educates and informs global partners on the threat of Iranian disinformation, including its manipulation of outcomes around elections and other international events. In the counterterrorism realm, our counterterrorism team understands that they're dealing with a fluid information environment and seeks to be agile, analytic, and proactive in countering the threats that face our homeland. Terrorist organizations seek to leverage the online space, combining their online and offline propaganda activities to multiply the impact of their operations and build a perception that they're growing and successful movements, because those are the movements that can pull in funding and draw recruits. And our job, of course, is to prevent this at every stage of the way in the area of propaganda and disinformation so that they can't do this. I would note in the counterterrorism context an increasing focus on racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. That comes in addition to our existing experience countering propaganda and disinformation by groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So specifically, the Global Engagement Center is a co-chair of the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS's Communications Working Group. The GEC led the development and is supporting the implementation of the de-ISIS Resiliency Counter Propaganda and Disinformation Campaign framework. This campaign takes a population-centric approach, building resiliency among audiences in Iraq and Syria that are the most vulnerable to ISIS's ideology and coercion. The Global Engagement Center's coordinator and special envoy serves as one of the 3 co-leads, along with the UK and the UAE, in the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS's Communications Working Group, which today brings together more than 50 organizations and nations. In this role, the GEC has led discussions with Communications Working Group partners on how ISIS is exploiting the COVID-19 crisis and its propaganda, and we've explored new ways to counter the group's narratives. Our UK co-leads on the Communications Working Group are amplifying and providing analysis of the coalition's communications activities through the Counter-Daesh Communications Cell in London, and challenging and degrading the legitimacy of ISIS globally. Through this overarching framework, members of the coalition are able to conduct activities independently of each other without fear of contradicting or duplicating the efforts of other partners. Let me talk a little bit about some of our efforts in East Africa. Globally, we focus on building resiliency to terrorist propaganda through working with local, national, and regional partners. Specifically, we're doing this in several East African countries. We are training teachers, youth, and community leaders to detect and respond to signs of radicalization in their communities. One program we're very proud of is called Somali Voices, where we partner with local implementers who built websites and social media platforms focused on countering messaging from extremist organizations. They've produced 30 radio programs that were broadcast nationally on a major Somali language station. This product had very high levels of engagement on its social media platforms, with 4.8 million people reached through Facebook and a 16% engagement rate, and 307,000 impressions on Twitter with a 36% engagement rate. As I mentioned before, we're also increasingly focused on racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, REMV being the US government acronym for that. Specifically, we are working with the US Institute of Peace on a year-long research program in partnership with the Resolve Academic Network. This focuses on foreign online REMV communications, information ecosystems, and audiences, with a particular emphasis on Europe and Australia. Last but certainly not least, let me talk a little bit more about our technology engagement. So our incorporation and assessment of technologies to counter propaganda and disinformation starts by understanding the methods and capabilities the threat actors employ. This threat actor toolkit is a continually evolving set of technologies and tactics that enable the adversary to conduct propaganda and disinformation campaigns at scale. Understanding how our adversaries are seeking to promote disinformation helps us in advancing tactics and concerns, of course, to counter them. So what we are looking at are all of the latest techniques to, for example, uncover fake accounts and messages pushed out by bots and trolls. So as technology continues to advance, the adversarial capabilities will be augmented by technology, but we, of course, can also identify and put technology in the service of our partners. So we have a number of specific programs here. Tech demos These are bi-weekly and are held to provide a forum for private sector companies to demonstrate technologies applicable to the disinformation challenge. They present these to US government stakeholders. We've conducted 49 demos of 91 technologies over the last 2 years. We also hold tech challenges. These are international events that provide a forum for foreign companies to demonstrate technologies that can help with the disinformation challenge in that country and can help some of our stakeholders there. We've had 2 of these already, one in the United Kingdom and one in Taiwan, and we have 3 scheduled for 2021. The GEC provides a certain amount of funding to the winner of the challenge for local implementation. Third, we maintain a technology test bed. This is for the use of all US departments and agencies to test the operational use of promising technologies that we identify through our tech demos. To date, we have tested 25 tools and 8 of them have been integrated into US government use. To further increase connectivity among this community of interest for the US government, foreign partners, industry, and academia, we maintain an online platform called Disinfo Cloud that shares findings and information on disinformation-related challenges. This platform today has almost 1,200 members and has assessed over 70 tools. We work very closely with our interagency partners, such as the Department of Defense, on counter-disinformation technologies and things that can enable them. And we have established a liaison in Silicon Valley with the purpose of sharing lessons learned and developing two-way communications about foreign disinformation and propaganda with our partners in the technology industry. So to summarize, the GEC today is providing significant analytic support to the interagency and to US embassies globally to inform their actions in the information space. The GEC is operating over 100 programs in 120 countries. It's leading US and international coordination on technology implementation through our tech demos, our tech challenges, and our test bed. And we're supporting multiple international coordination mechanisms to provide a framework for coordination that can be sustained and can endure over the long term. So with that, I'll pause and I look forward to your questions.
Daniel, thank you so much for those introductory remarks. I want to invite everybody who's watching to submit questions. There are 2 ways to do that. If you are on the Zoom webinar, you can do that through the Q&A function. And if you are not, you can send a question to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask you a couple of questions, Daniel. I see we've already got a few questions coming in on the Q&A function, and I expect we'll be getting more on the email any moment. So just to start off, if you could give us a little bit of the kind of historical arc of the development of what is now the Global Engagement Center. There's been a lot of change within the various iterations of this organization over time. Before Congress established the GEC in 2017, there was the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communication created in 2011. Can you talk about the development of the GEC mission over time and how it differs from what CSCC did back in the day? If I recall correctly, CSCC spent a lot of time debating terrorists online and creating, GIFs or memes to challenge their narrative. Did that work? What was the process of deciding how to change? Tell us a little bit about the arc of the development as we've understood this problem set in the toolkit to where we are today.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, that's a daunting task, and I'll start with the caveat that I wasn't there for all of it. I was there for quite a bit of it. I would say 3 things have changed if you're just going to compare where we are today to where we were in 2011 when we started up the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. First is that the mission itself is clearly a lot broader. Our congressional legislation is agnostic. It doesn't actually name threat actors. So it's really focusing us on the problem and then leaving us to define through the policy process what the focus should be in terms of Russia, China, Iran, and terrorist organizations. So it's a much broader mission. Secondly, it has the force of legislation. So this isn't an executive order that could, in theory, be canceled by a new administration. This is legislation that is setting up a firmer institutional foundation. That's sort of the overall context. Compared to the CSCC, we're obviously a larger organization. We're over 100 people. The budget is in the tens of millions of dollars compared to the handful in the CSCC. I would say the biggest change is that we are much more focused on partners. If there's the philosophy behind the work of the Global Engagement Center is a mission center, if you will, that's at the hub of a whole network of partnerships. And it's really a network of networks because this branches out to very large groups all over the globe. We really understand that not only is the US government rarely the most effective communicator with the target audiences, whether those are the targets of terrorist propaganda or the targets of a Russian disinformation campaign, the US government has got certain advantages in terms of resources, it has advantages in terms of relationships, but it's hardly ever the best communicator. So we have to work through partners. So that's probably the single biggest difference between what's happening today and what the CSCC or the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications tried to do in the early days. I think there were some good things that came out of the CSCC experience. We learned a lot. But if you wanted to sum it up, it was sort of the little office that could, or it tried to be the little office that could, striving single-handedly to take on all of these different challenges. Now we recognize that this is such a large and multifaceted problem that we really need to work through these partnerships. On the specific question of, online engagement with terrorists, I would say that this was never as big a part of what the CSCC did as some thought. It was just very visible, and particularly when they did it in English. I think that the verdict was decidedly mixed on that effort, and that the ultimate conclusion, although I would certainly invite researchers in the audience to go back and re-examine that, because I think there are still interesting questions to be answered, but the ultimate conclusion was where we are today, which is a very robust effort to identify and work with partners.
So my second question before we go to the questions that are coming in, I thank everybody for those questions that have come in and invite more, is this. Terrorist propaganda, but ISIS propaganda in particular, includes a very wide array of content. We're talking about videos, posts, images, memes, text, which is intended to provide a narrative, a blueprint of the world that can then mobilize people to violent action. So how do you break up that cycle of information from someone who's an information consumer to preventing them from becoming a consumer that goes all the way to becoming a violent extremist?
Yeah, so I think that on the ISIS front, let me break this down into three major categories, in all of which I think we've made a lot of progress. So let me sort of start with a snapshot of what this looked like a few years ago, and then toggle with what it looks like today. So if we look at the supply side, the demand side, and the physical space as the three main categories. On the supply side, back when ISIS was in its heyday, they were supplying an enormous amount of readily available, emotionally charged, well-produced propaganda. And you saw in 2014 and 2015, a huge amount of analysis, some of it coming from folks like Aaron Zellin and your center, just showing how extensive that network was. So that was on the supply side. On the demand side, you had people who were interested in this message, and they had incredibly easy tools to go out and find it. And then once they would go out and find it, they would start to interact with people who could pull them into a geographically accessible location where they could go and get training. This was really the worst case scenario that we all confronted in the counterterrorism community in 2014, 2015. So if we look today at those three different components, what we see, I think, is fairly significant progress in all three. So on the supply side, ISIS, which has been hemmed in by lots of everything from military strike to other constraints, is simply producing a lot less propaganda. That propaganda in turn is available on far fewer platforms. Here, I have to call out the work that some of the major platforms have done, not just to make sure that this isn't as easily available, but to exchange information with each other so that these trans-platform campaigns are no longer as practical for groups like ISIS. So on the supply and the demand side, you've got some real progress. Furthermore, on the demand side, there is, I think, a broader effort through places like the Global Engagement Center to work with partners who can provide alternative narratives, people who have got credibility and standing with target audiences to inoculate them against ISIS propaganda, either by showing how it works or providing perhaps religiously grounded counters to it. There's a whole variety of tools and techniques out there, and they really vary compared, by the setting. So lastly, on the physical safe haven, that simply doesn't exist in the form that it did back then. So I think that if you look today where we are vis-a-vis ISIS, we're in a much better place, both on the, on the supply, the demand, and the physical safe haven fronts.
Great. So we've got a bunch of questions. We're going to start going through some of those. Tom Warwick asks if you could speak to the ways GEC is currently working with Department of Homeland Security's CISA and the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention.
Thank you, Tom. Nice to hear from you. Always good to hear from a former colleague in government. As it happens, I had my latest interaction with CISA on Friday, kind of a routine phone call. We've worked closely with CISA in the last year on some of the efforts to safeguard the US presidential election. The Global Engagement Center is focused abroad, so we don't have a domestic remit, but we can help to inform the efforts of our domestic colleagues, and we did that in our collaboration with our colleagues in CISA. We are exploring ways to potentially create even closer links between our offices. But the bottom line is that we're constantly in touch with each other at various levels. I'm in touch with my colleagues in DHS, and we've got our interagency coordination cell, our I2C2, that is in touch with them. We are working hard to make sure that our analysis that we produce is available and is supplied on a regular basis to our colleagues on the domestic front so that they understand what the major threat actors are doing abroad, and they can integrate that into what they're doing domestically. But the bottom line, Tom, is that we're in touch with each other, and then we're often in some of the same interagency forums, so we're working together closely.
A follow-up question from someone else who's in government at the moment asks, how widely available is the disinformation cloud? Is it accessible to contract implementers of CVE resilience building programs?
I'd have to get back to you on the exact parameters of who can join. It's pretty widely available. We've got over 1,000 people who are signed up. Please feel free to contact us either through Matt or directly. And I believe Disinfo Cloud is online. You can go, and I think that there is an email where you can contact us. But we try to make it as widely available as we can. And please get in touch with us, and we'll figure it out.
There already are a few people that are asking for your email, but thanks for throwing me under the bus there. I appreciate that. Your presentation, one of our questioners asked, begs the question of why conspiracy theories are so prominent in the United States and what GEC tools tell us about why this is the case. So in other words, why do counter narratives not work? And how do we build resilience domestically to internal propagandists? And I'll caveat this as noting that GEC's remit is abroad, but the propaganda is not respecting boundaries.
Sure. Thanks for the reminder, Matt. And I'll just reiterate that our legislation focuses us on the problem abroad, but also we're at the State Department and our own legal authorities reinforce that there is a lot of academic research on the kind of first mover advantage in the world of narratives. And one of the reasons why we often look to build resilience is that once a narrative is out there, once people have heard it, it's very hard to dislodge it. So there is a fair amount of research that says that. One thing I will say, and I was remiss before, we had a great collaboration with DHS in funding the development of Harmony Square, which is a game that you can play online. And it's an inoculation game where you're trying to undermine a community by using disinformation, but the reason you're doing that is to play the game and understand how these techniques work, and that's how the inoculation works. This game's received a lot of media coverage, but it is a joint DHS and GC effort to help to build resiliency. So once again, the way that we do this is by shining a light and potentially by working with domestic partners, but just to be absolutely clear, we, the GC, don't work in the domestic space.
A lot of people asking very similar questions about that issue, and a lot of interest on how GEC activities, even if they don't occur in or don't target the domestic space, have ramifications. And I'm sure this is given recent events. So another of our questions on another theme asks, do you see a growing threat in cyber terrorism from non-state actors?
So just, to be very clear, we're not in the business of doing cyber threat assessments. So that's a little bit out of our mission set. We do see a lot of information exchange between and among all the nefarious actors. So there is a constant kind of upping of the ante in terms of using tools and techniques, et cetera. But we are focused on the propaganda and disinformation lens. So we're a little bit less focused on some of the specific cyber tools or the offensive cyber action. So we don't do cyber threat assessments. That said, we certainly see, when either nation states or non-state actors are doing things in that realm, they're all watching each other and learning.
So let's be blunt. One of our participants asked, governments are typically not the best voice for this kind of a job, but here GEC has successfully carved out space to work in this field. So how does the GEC identify credible partners who know the local environment and can convince them to work together with the US government? Is that cooperation with the US government made public for transparency's sake? And does the GC also look for local influencers? And do they know who they're working with in these programs? Do they know they're working with the US government?
So the first thing, everyone who works with us knows they're working with us. That's a basic ground rule. The identification of partners is much more of an art than a science, and some of these folks come to us through open competitions. We have a couple of mechanisms like the Information Access Fund, where organizations can send in an application or apply for funding with us. We work very closely with our embassies in the field, who often are really the best experts on the local environment, on the local partners, and they often will identify partners. Some of our partners, as I said, are foreign governments, and that comes through our colleagues in the regional bureaus, et cetera. Some of our partners are commercial entities or academic institutions. To give you an example of a partnership that is entirely open, the Harmony Square. If you look at the materials on Harmony Square, we're simply listed as one of the funders. In other cases, we defer to our partner on how they want to present their relationship. But the bottom line is we have a whole range of ways of identifying partners, but it really is more of an art than a science. And as we do more of this, it becomes easier. One thing I'll say, Matt was asking about the kind of historical arc of development. There is now more kind of muscle memory in the US government. There are longer standing relationships. There's a communication of people who have worked in this space, and that helps. But broadly speaking, the way that we identify partners is not fundamentally different than the way that our colleagues in democracy promotion or human rights or any of the other parts of the US government that work with partners, we function in a very similar way.
Great. As I'm looking at the questions and trying to group a bunch together, recognizing again the focus abroad, does GEC work closely in tandem with those agencies and departments that are focused on this issue set domestically to kind of divvy up the pie? So if you think about the Russian imperial movement being designated as a foreign terrorist organization and its connections to individuals in multiple countries, including the United States, you know, tell us a little bit about that cooperation where the GEC does its part focused abroad, but acknowledging that that's a target set that does have impact here in the United States. You know, what are the limitations or the lack thereof of GEC working on issue sets like REMV when it comes to things domestic, even if what GEC is doing is really focused abroad?
Yeah, it's a complicated area because these problems don't respect national borders, and there are so many tools that facilitate the exchange of information, of course, across borders. So the simplest way that we can help our domestic partners is by increasing their understanding of the problem, really increasing their understanding of how these threat actors operate, things like our Russian Pillars report. And putting that in the hands of the people domestically who can do things about it. So that's often a group that's not, maybe the first traditional partner for places like the State Department. And we're grateful to our colleagues in the domestic agencies who broadened our perspective. I, for example, wasn't as familiar with the key role played by secretaries of state in safeguarding state, in safeguarding national elections. And we're working hard to make sure not only that we can make our analytic products available to those groups, but also to understand better what some of the questions they have are. Because, once again, we are comfortable working, through our legislation, our authorities on the problem set outside of the US, but many of those tools and techniques hold lessons for those who will be, dealing with the problem domestically. So, it's a sort of classic interagency collaboration where we have to be mindful of our authorities. For example, we don't look at the social media activity of US citizens, et cetera. We're very mindful of the legal constraints that we need to observe, but we also want to make sure that we are exchanging the information that's appropriate to exchange and that can enrich the efforts of our domestic colleagues.
Right. So a few people are asking if you could mention a case study or two outside maybe kind of the big three adversaries that you mentioned, more specifically maybe in the counterterrorism space, about the counter-propaganda activities and their outcomes.
A case study, I already talked a little bit about our work in East Africa, and I'd say, that's a kind of case study for the way that we seek to approach this today, in that, once again, Matt was asking about how we did this a couple of years back, where it was a little bit more focused on US government tools, people sitting, as US government, trying to counter some of the stuff, whereas now it's a little bit more focused on the partner aspect. But I would say that the real case study is layering the various types of partnership that the GEC is able to pursue now. And that's really much broader than anything we ever had before. So the case study really needs to encompass not just a specific partner out in a specific region, but also the tools that we're able to identify through our technology engagement programs, the mechanisms that we have to share those tools across a community of stakeholders, the analysis that we can perform to identify where the vulnerable audiences are, where the adversarial propaganda activity is, the experience in finding and selecting partners, and then mechanisms to support them, and then the integration with some of our international partnerships through things like the Defeat ISIS coalition. So it's a richer and broader effort. So what I would say in terms of a case study is, yes, there is an element here, there's a way of looking at it where you're going to see one specific organization potentially working with the Global Engagement Center or, some other part of the US government in a specific area. But I would urge you all to think of that as part of a much broader effort that's layered in with technology, with industry, with interagency partners, and with international partners.
Several people are asking questions about the types of platforms that are spreading disinformation and propaganda, and whether these are all public facing or whether they're closed or dark web, and what you're doing on that type of a kind of deeper platform.
So the answer is everything. All platforms, any platform can be a conduit, can be a vehicle for disinformation, just as it can be a conduit for information. So, what this means, though, is that whatever area you're looking at, you really have to be very cognizant of what are people using there. So, for example, when we were looking to help partners in Taiwan, they were working on social media platforms that are used by folks there like Line. The complexity, of course, is that there's a very large number of platforms. Their technical characteristics are all different. Some of them are organizations we don't have any real communication with, some we do. And so there's a constant process of research and discovery. Our technology engagement team is not only deeply engaged in tracking all of the various platforms and the tools that you can use to identify, for example, as I think someone mentioned in the question, disinformation on the dark web or in some of these other environments. But our technology folks are in close communication with our threat teams so that we're linking this to what the adversary is doing. So the real trick here is, and we understand we're not going to have a global encyclopedia of every single platform. It's just not technically possible or practical. What we want to do is synchronize this with our understanding of adversarial activity, and of course, prioritized with threats to U.S. national security so that we can then follow it there. But the bottom line is, any platform that carries information can carry disinformation and can also be a platform where you inoculate people against it, where you identify it and fight it, where you work with the people on the platform to reduce the demand side, where you increase resiliency, or to reduce the supply side, you increase resiliency so that you reduce the demand side. So it's really kind of an across the board effort encompassing lots of platforms, and we're constantly identifying new ones.
The world's a pretty big place, and you can't be everywhere all the time. How does the GEC determine where to focus its efforts? When it comes to counterterrorism in particular, is the focus on those groups that pose the greatest threats to the homeland in line with the national strategy for counterterrorism? Or does GEC focus more broadly on regional groups that don't necessarily threaten the United States or the homeland, but promote regional conflict and instability, pose longer-term threats, or threats to allies, or, for example, in line with the Global Fragility Act, would be good targets for early preventative action?
So the Global Engagement Center is a part of the broader U.S. national security enterprise, and our primary focus is always going to be the safety and security of the homeland. We are part of the broader process that sets priorities, and that has, as those of you who work in government and observed from the outside know, that's got the National Security Council involved. It has our colleagues in the regional bureaus and on the 7th floor of the State Department, where the secretary and the deputy and top officials sit, and also our colleagues in the intelligence community who are constantly producing assessments of the threat. So that process sets the priorities for the overall national security enterprise. And then we have to, within that, be opportunistic in determining where we can make the greatest difference. And that's where the work comes in with our colleagues in the field, because they have a unique vantage point, and we have a great advantage being in the State Department, tapping that network of foreign service officers, of all the outstanding professionals at our embassies. And then, as we discussed before, that art of finding partners who are going to be able to do the work on the ground. So it's a multi-tiered system, but the fundamental aim, of course, is to make the homeland a safer place.
Social media companies' success in removing extremist content from their platforms has been laudable, but their filters often catch U.S. government counter messaging that mentions terrorism or ISIS. This is something that some of the various centers around the world, some of which the U.S. partners with, have routinely faced, Salab Center and others. Has the GEC representative in Silicon Valley engaged these issues in the past? And if so, has he or she had success in ensuring that US government or coalition messages can get through social media companies' filters?
Thanks. I'm not familiar with any recent instances of this specific phenomenon. What I will say is that our representative in Silicon Valley now has got pretty good regular interactions that are focused on information sharing. What we want to make sure is that some of the analytic insights we're reaching, we can convey to folks in the platforms who, of course, have their own sources and their own vantage point on this. I would stress here that their terms of service are their own. We don't ask them to do anything. Whatever actions they take are in the context of their own terms of service. So I would just say in general, two things. One, as those in the counterterrorism community have documented, there has been a very long-standing and effective effort to close off some of the supply on the social media platforms. And then secondly, there are many more forums for information exchange with industry than there used to be. And I think together that ameliorates the problem that you mentioned, but I'm just not aware of any really specific instances in the recent past.
I've got a bunch of people asking if you could please tell us a little bit more about metrics and evaluation, what's being done to evaluate our efforts, and if you could go beyond some of the metrics you mentioned in your opening remarks, such as the amount of engagement or the amount of produced material.
Sure. I mean, this is a very long-standing and of course highly relevant question in this area. So there is a kind of platonic ideal perhaps of this measure of effectiveness that we would one day get an individual who's moving along the pathway to commit an act of violence, and that person intersects with a completely discrete, isolated US government program or action by one of our partners, and that changes their trajectory, and we're able to link it perfectly and show how we broke that cycle. I don't know if that's ever going to actually happen. In theory, this perhaps has happened. In practice, I don't know, because human behavior has got so many different inputs, and the ability to actually collect information is limited. So we've gotten more sophisticated in the kinds of information we collect about our programs. It's not just, eyeballs and engagement rates. There is specifically for the use of things like ad tech technology that gives you insights into specific demographics, A/B testing, which lets you throw different versions of a product or a graphic or a meme or something out there and see what the reactions are before and after testing. We do have a more sophisticated sense than we used to. I would just caution the audience and say that that kind of platonic ideal of a yes, we were absolutely effective because this one action that we took short-circuited this one move to violence. I don't know that that's ever going to happen. What I would say is that, particularly in the case of ISIS, if we look at that broad trajectory from where that organization was in 2014, 2015, and where they are today, the combination of everything from some of the kinetic activities to the influence activities, some of the things the social media companies have done, the partnerships that we've established, the great work by our colleagues in the coalition, all of that taken together has clearly had a very significant effect on ISIS's ability to recruit people and carry out attacks. It's by no means a complete effort. There is still a huge threat out there to counter. There are obviously new threats, but what I would say is that in the aggregate, there has clearly been an effect. And, I put this almost back as a subject to discuss further with the group and a challenge, because I know there are a lot of great researchers out here. Disaggregating and trying to figure out which of our activities had which effect is something that we're engaged in. We look forward to working with this community on. So bottom line is, we've made progress in this area. It's by no means perfect, but I think overall we should recognize that there has been some considerable success in recent years.
One area where your work kind of crosses over the kind of counterterrorism and great power competition baskets, which I would argue are not mutually exclusive, but very much overlap, is in the area of Iran and Iran's use of proxies for terrorist purposes, whether it's Lebanese Hezbollah or some of the Shia militias. If you look at the attack in Erbil just the other day, can you speak a little bit to GEC's work dealing with propaganda, disinformation coming from Iran, and specifically related to its activities in this area related to state sponsorship of terrorism?
Sure. So, Iran remains one of the foremost state sponsors of terrorism, and it threatens our forces and partners in the region. It uses global influence mechanisms to present itself in a positive light. It tries to minimize its domestic troubles in the world and further its geopolitical goals. It maligns our credibility and the credibility of our allies. They've got a global influence toolkit, if you will, that consists of official statements, state-run media operations. They've got proxy media outlets. They carry out online influence operations, and of course, offensive cyber operations. So you're right, it's a state actor that then intersects with well-known terrorist actors. And what we do in this area is to expose and counter Iranian malign influence globally by coordinating with our interagency partners. We work with third-party voices. We work with foreign allies. And specifically, I would highlight the role of fact-based journalism in the Middle East that counters Iranian propaganda and exposes some of the mechanisms that they use for their propaganda.
That last comment, I think, is very important and answers several questions that came in about how important is it for there to be an open media and how difficult is it when countries crack down on media in terms of their inability for independent media to crack down on propaganda and disinformation. I think you answered that just now. We have a few questions that ask about the tension between, on the one hand, cracking down on radical content online, and on the other hand, if you do that, sometimes radicalizing people further. One of your counterparts, foreign nation counterparts, is participating today and says, fascinating discussion, thank you. Racially motivated terrorism presents some unique challenges. What is your thinking on the propagation of terrorist discourse through manifestos, such as those produced by Anders Breivik in Norway and Tarrant from the mosque attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand? We seem to be seeing a ripple effect of inspiration taken from the writings of terrorist actors who carry out horrific attacks. How can that inspiration be dampened?
Well, I don't know that there's any silver bullet solution to things like radical manifestos. In fact, some of the early work that I did in this field 20 years ago was translating some of the Arabic language manifestos coming from major Al-Qaeda ideologues. So it's something near and dear to my heart. I mean, I think the most basic thing is to understand the ecosystem that they feed, to understand. I mean, there are two things here. One is the intellectual ecosystem that they feed, because there are manifestos that propagate ideas. And then the second is they can be a mechanism for counterterrorism professionals to map networks. That's not necessarily the primary focus here in the Global Engagement Center. We're more focused on the intellectual side, but they have those two functions. I was literally just reading about a case in Singapore where a young man who had radicalized and was planning attacks against mosques there was apparently reading one of the manifestos by, I believe it was the Christchurch shooters. So there's a world of these manifestos out there. So I think on the most basic level, we need to keep track of this and try to understand the intellectual environment. But for counterterrorism professionals who are more involved in tracking actual networks, they can also be a tool.
A lot of questions asking how the COVID-19 global pandemic has impacted the problem set that the Global Engagement Center deals with on a daily basis. And specifically, Russia and China have clearly been active trying to exploit the crisis, but have they done so by promoting terrorist or other extremist narratives?
So I don't know that we've seen that. What we have seen in the COVID crisis is both Russia and China exploiting it for their propaganda aims. And also what we've seen is a convergence of those narratives and an activation of networks. So we've also seen a convergence of techniques where we have seen China adopt more of these sort of Russian-style troll networks and troll farms to promote these narratives. So we have certainly seen that. I'm not aware off the top of my head of any intersections with actual terrorist messaging here, but I think that, you know, the exploitation of a global health crisis for propaganda purposes and to leverage, obviously false narratives is more than enough of a challenge to deal with.
So you made passing reference earlier, Daniel, to welcoming, some research efforts from groups on the outside. So a selfish plug for those of us who are in think tanks and academia. GEC actually has a really active and engaged academic liaison effort. In what ways has the Global Engagement Center benefited from this outreach to think tanks and to academia? And what are some of the knowledge gaps that GEC efforts have identified that could benefit from academic research?
So I'm not trying to flatter the group when I say the 5 minutes left is not enough time to thank the academic and think tank community for its contribution. It's really enormous. I'd be remiss if I didn't convey from our Iran team that they have found the Washington Institute's Hezbollah interactive map to be extremely useful for understanding that network. But, every day there are products that come out, and as you said, Matt, we have a very robust effort to interact with the think tank, the academic community, et cetera. I think all of the issues that we've raised today, all of the questions that have been asked are going to benefit from attention outside of government. We have got our own communities in government that look at this, but we really benefit when we get the outside research, when we are able to have discussions back and forth. We really make an effort to reach out. We have partnerships in that community. The space is so dynamic. There are so many questions to be answered that it's just an indispensable part of it. On the specific question that you asked before about effectiveness, I would welcome, additional research from the community. I'd be open to conversations about, are there any additional sources of information that we might be able to make available? I can't promise anything, of course, but, we want to be able to benefit from the intellectual firepower, from the incredible connections in that community, and we look forward to working with all of you in the future.
We have time, I think, for one last question, and I apologize to those of you who asked questions we weren't able to get to them. As a sign of a great presentation and a lot of interest, Daniel, that we have probably 25 questions that we're not going to get to today, even with me combining them together. So our last question is this. Not all radicalization happens online. Much of what we've discussed today has been in the online space, though you did mention the Somali Voices radio program. Can you talk a little bit briefly about GEC programs that are not online but are in the real world?
Sure. We're keenly aware that not everything happens online. We're all online right here, and, we're obviously all online every day, but we work every day with our partners in embassies and across, the world to find who is out there working in physical space in the real world. What are the audiences that are being targeted there? This really comes back to that thing I focused on at the beginning, which is the best possible understanding of the problem. And that can't be limited at the beginning by saying, oh, we're only looking on social media, et cetera. We really need to answer the question, how are people getting their information? Where are these campaigns unfolding? If it's a word of mouth campaign that's targeting retired people at markets, well, then it's the job of those who would seek to counter that to find the right communicator, the right way to get there. So, I'm not going to cite a specific example, but I will say that we are absolutely aware of this, and no one should take away from this that, the Global Engagement Center is, an online effort. It absolutely is not. We are as focused on what happens offline as online, because propaganda and disinformation are problems that affect the totality of human engagement and interaction. And, the solution has to encompass that as well.
Daniel, allow me to thank you and your team on behalf of everybody for taking the time to talk with us today and to explain some of the work that the Global Engagement Center does. Thanks for all you do, and thank you to everybody who participated today. Thank you especially to all of you who asked questions today. Feel free to follow up with me at the Washington Institute. We can continue this conversation. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Daniel, GEC, thank you very much.